When Paul Walker received a phone call from his daughter's school saying she'd been barred from attending prom, he thought there had been some mistake. But as he listened to the principal's cold, dismissive explanation, something about behavioral issues that didn't exist and dress code violations that made no sense, Paul realized this wasn't about rules. This was about power, about a man who had decided that Meadow Walker, despite her perfect grades and spotless record, simply didn't belong. So Paul did what he always did when someone he loved was treated unfairly. He showed up quietly, unannounced, and what happened next in that principal's office would expose a truth far uglier than anyone expected. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Westwood High School, casting long shadows across the polished hallways. Students moved between classes in their usual rhythm: laughter, whispered conversations, the metallic slam of lockers closing. But in room 204, Meadow Walker sat alone at her desk, staring at a letter that had just been handed to her by the vice principal. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words again, hoping she'd misunderstood due to recent behavioral concerns and failure to adhere to school standards. Your attendance at the upcoming senior prom has been revoked. This decision is final. Meadow blinked. Behavioral concerns. She had a 3.9 GPA. She volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend. She'd never even gotten detention. She looked up at Mrs. Harper, the vice principal, who stood with her arms crossed near the door. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was something cold in her eyes. "I don't understand," Meadow said quietly. "What behavioral concerns?" Ms. Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not my decision to discuss. Principal Donovan will explain if you'd like to schedule a meeting." Meadow's throat tightened. "But I haven't done anything wrong." Ms. Harper didn't respond. She simply turned and left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. Meadow sat there in silence, the letter still clutched in her hand. She felt numb, confused, and underneath it all, a sharp sting of humiliation, because tomorrow everyone at school would know, everyone would see that she, Meadow Walker, the quiet girl who kept her head down and worked hard, had been banned from prom, and she had no idea why. When Meadow got home that afternoon, she walked through the front door of their modest Malibu house and dropped her backpack by the stairs. Her father, Paul Walker, was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked up when he heard her come in, and immediately his expression shifted. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, setting down his mug. "You okay?" Meadow tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine." Paul studied her for a moment. He'd been a father long enough to know when something was wrong. "Meadow," he said gently, stepping closer, "talk to me." She hesitated, then pulled the letter from her bag and handed it to him without a word. Paul read it slowly, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at her, his blue eyes sharp but filled with concern. "What is this?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with something harder. Meadow shrugged, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know, Dad. They just gave it to me today. No warning, no explanation." Paul read the letter again, his fingers tightening around the paper. "Behavioral concerns? You've never been in trouble a day in your life." "I know," Meadow whispered. Her voice cracked slightly. "But they won't tell me what I did." Paul set the letter down on the counter and took a deep breath. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. For her, "Did you ask to speak to the principal?" he asked. Meadow nodded. "Miss Harper said I could schedule a meeting, but she made it sound like it wouldn't change anything." Paul's expression darkened. He'd dealt with unfair systems before. He'd seen how people in positions of power could wield it carelessly, cruelly, especially when they thought no one was watching. "Listen to me," Paul said, placing a hand on Meadow's shoulder. "You didn't do anything wrong, and we're going to fix this." Meadow looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears she'd been holding back all day. "What if they don't listen?" Paul's voice was firm, unwavering. "Then I'll make them listen." The next morning, Paul Walker walked through the doors of Westwood High School, dressed in a simple gray t-shirt, worn jeans, and his favorite faded baseball cap. No sunglasses, no entourage, just a father coming to speak on behalf of his daughter. The receptionist at the front desk looked up, her eyes widening slightly when she recognized him. But Paul gave her a polite smile and said calmly, "I'd like to speak with Principal Donovan, please." She hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Do you have an appointment?" Paul's smile didn't waver, but his tone was firm. "No, but I think he'll want to see me." The receptionist picked up the phone, murmured something Paul couldn't hear, then hung up. She looked back at him, her expression uncertain. "He'll see you in a few minutes. You can wait in the main office." Paul nodded and sat down in one of the plastic chairs near the window. He watched students pass by in the hallway, laughing, talking, living the kind of normal high school life Meadow should have been enjoying. But instead, she'd been singled out, humiliated, and Paul needed to know why. 10 minutes later, the office door opened, and a man in his early 50s stepped out. He wore a crisp suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression carefully composed. This was Principal Richard Donovan. He extended a hand toward Paul, his smile professional but cold. "Mr. Walker, I wasn't expecting you." Paul stood and shook his hand, his grip firm. "I wasn't expecting to be here either." Donovan gestured toward his office. "Please come in." Paul followed him inside, and the door closed behind them with a soft click. The office was immaculate. Polished wood desk, framed certificates on the walls, a photo of Donovan shaking hands with some local politician. Everything about the space screamed control. Donovan sat behind his desk and folded his hands, his expression neutral. "I assume you're here about Meadow." Paul didn't sit. He stood in front of the desk, his arms crossed. "Yeah, I want to know why my daughter was banned from prom." Donovan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Mr. Walker, I understand this is difficult, but the decision was made in accordance with school policy." Paul's jaw tightened. "What policy?" Donovan leaned back in his chair, his tone measured. "Meadow has been displaying behavior that we consider disruptive to the school environment." Paul blinked. "Disruptive? She's never been in trouble. She's on the honor roll." Donovan nodded slowly. "Academically, yes, she's a strong student, but there are other factors we take into consideration." Paul leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "What factors?" Donovan hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Paul saw it, the lie forming, the excuse being constructed. Meadow has been associating with students who have less than ideal reputations. Donovan said carefully, "We've received complaints from other parents about her influence." Paul's eyes narrowed. "Complaints? From who?" Donovan's expression remained neutral. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information." Paul took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "So, you're telling me that my daughter, who has never broken a rule, never caused a problem, never done anything but work hard and be kind, is being punished because of anonymous complaints?" Donovan's jaw tightened. "Mr. Walker, I understand you're upset, but—" Paul interrupted him, his voice quiet but carrying undeniable weight. "No, you don't understand, because if you did, you wouldn't be sitting there lying to my face." The room went silent. Donovan's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" Paul leaned forward, his voice steady. "This isn't about Meadow's behavior. This is about something else, and I'm going to find out what." Donovan stood slowly, his professional mask slipping just slightly. "Mr. Walker, I don't appreciate the accusation." Paul cut him off again, his tone calm but unyielding. "And I don't appreciate you punishing my daughter for no reason." He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at Donovan. "I'm not leaving until this gets fixed," Paul said quietly. "And trust me, you're going to want to fix it." And with that, Paul Walker walked out of the office, leaving Principal Donovan standing alone, his carefully constructed authority beginning to crumble, because Paul Walker wasn't just a father protecting his daughter. He was a man who understood that silence in the face of injustice was the same as complicity, and he wasn't going to be silent. Paul Walker didn't go home after leaving Principal Donovan's office. Instead, he sat in his car in the school parking lot, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the brick facade of Westwood High. Something wasn't right. Donovan's explanation had been too rehearsed, too vague. Anonymous complaints, disruptive behavior. It was all smoke. Paul pulled out his phone and called someone he trusted. Rebecca Chen, a lawyer and old friend who specialized in education law. "Rebecca," Paul said when she picked up, "I need your help." 20 minutes later, Rebecca was sitting beside him in the car, reading through the letter Meadow had been given. Her expression grew darker with each line. "This is garbage," she said finally, tossing the letter onto the dashboard. "No specifics, no due process, they can't just ban a student from a school event without documentation." Paul nodded. "That's what I thought." Rebecca looked at him. "Paul, this feels personal. Has Meadow had any issues with anyone at the school? Teachers? Other students?" Paul thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not that she's mentioned. She keeps to herself mostly, focuses on her grades, volunteers on weekends. She's not the type to make enemies." Rebecca frowned. "Then why would Donovan target her?" Paul's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Over the next 2 days, Paul quietly began asking questions. He spoke to Meadows' teachers, who all said the same thing. She was respectful, hardworking, never a problem. He talked to her friends who were shocked that she'd been banned from prom. And then, on the 3rd day, he spoke to a sophomore named Marcus who worked in the school's administrative office as a student aide. Marcus hesitated at first, clearly nervous, but when Paul assured him that he wasn't in trouble, the kid finally opened up. "Look, Mr. Walker," Marcus said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I'm not supposed to say anything, but there's been talk." Paul leaned in. "What kind of talk?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Some of the parents, like the ones on the PTA board, they've been pushing Donovan to control certain students." Paul frowned. "Control how?" Marcus hesitated. "They want the school to have a certain image, for college recruiters, donors, that kind of thing, and they've been complaining about students who they think don't fit." Paul's stomach twisted. "And Meadow?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I heard Mrs. Whitmore, she's the PTA president, tell Donovan that Meadow was setting a bad example." Paul's voice was low, controlled. "What does that mean?" Marcus looked down at his shoes. I think it's because of who you are, Mr. Walker. Some of the parents don't like that Meadow's dad is, famous. They think she gets special treatment or something, and Mrs. Whitmore's been pushing Donovan to make sure Meadow doesn't overshadow the other students." Paul sat back, processing. This wasn't about Meadow's behavior. This was about jealousy, about power, about parents who wanted to control the narrative. Of the school and Meadow, simply because of who her father was, had become a target. Paul thanked Marcus and walked back to his car. He sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, his mind racing. This wasn't just about prom anymore. This was about a system that allowed people in power to punish students for no reason other than spite, and Paul wasn't going to let that stand. The next morning, Paul walked back into Westwood High, but this time, he wasn't alone. Rebecca Chen walked beside him, carrying a briefcase, and behind them, 3 other parents whose children had also been mysteriously disciplined by Donovan over the past year, followed quietly. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw them. "Mr. Walker, you can't just—" "We have an appointment," Rebecca said smoothly, handing her a document. "We're here to speak with Principal Donovan and the PTA board now." The receptionist stammered, then picked up the phone. 10 minutes later, Paul, Rebecca, and the other parents were seated in the school's conference room. Across from them sat Principal Donovan, looking significantly less composed than before. And beside him, 3 members of the PTA board, including Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled hair and an expression of barely concealed disdain. Rebecca opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "Principal Donovan, we're here to discuss the unlawful suspension of multiple students from school activities without due process." Donovan shifted in his seat. "I don't know what you're talking about." Rebecca slid the documents across the table. "These are records of every student who's been disciplined by this administration over the past 2 years. And what's interesting is that every single one of them has something in common." Mrs. Whitmore frowned. "And what's that?" Rebecca looked her directly in the eye. "They're all children of parents this PTA board doesn't approve of." The room went silent. Paul leaned forward, his voice calm but carrying undeniable weight. "My daughter was banned from prom not because she did anything wrong, but because you didn't like the idea of her being there." Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed. "That's absurd." Paul cut her off. "Is it? Because I have a witness who heard you tell Principal Donovan that Meadow was setting a bad example." Donovan's face went pale. Paul continued, his tone unwavering. "You wanted control. You wanted to decide who gets to be part of this school's story. And when my daughter didn't fit your narrative, you tried to erase her." Mrs. Whitmore opened her mouth, but no words came out. Rebecca stood, her voice firm. "We're filing a formal complaint with the school district, and unless this decision is reversed immediately, we'll be pursuing legal action." Donovan looked at Mrs. Whitmore, who sat frozen, her carefully constructed authority crumbling. Finally, Donovan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The decision will be reversed." Paul stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Donovan's. "Good, because this isn't just about my daughter. It's about every student who's been punished for no reason other than someone else's insecurity." He turned and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. "And one more thing," Paul said quietly. "If I ever hear about another student being treated this way, I won't be coming back for a meeting. I'll be coming back with cameras." The message was clear, As Paul walked out of the school with Rebecca and the other parents, he felt something shift. Not just relief, but clarity, because this wasn't just about Meadow anymore. This was about standing up, speaking out, and making sure that the people who thought they could hide behind titles and power knew one simple truth. Some fathers don't back down, and Paul Walker was one of them. 3 days later, the school held an emergency assembly. Principal Donovan stood at the podium, his expression tight, his voice carefully measured. "We want to apologize," he began, "for any confusion regarding recent disciplinary actions. Moving forward, we will be implementing a new transparency policy to ensure all students are treated fairly." In the back of the auditorium, Meadow sat with her friends, tears in her eyes, not from sadness, from relief. Paul stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching. He caught Meadow's eye across the room and gave her a small nod. She smiled, and in that moment, everything was right again, because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up, one person willing to say, "Enough." And Paul Walker had done exactly that, not because he was famous, but because he was a father, and that, more than anything, was what mattered most.